I'm going to talk to you today about the Chinese belief that the state should be prioritized over any individual's rights. Now, what I mean by this is that the rights to free speech and the rights to freedom of assembly may be violated if they threaten the state. Now, we see this quite frequently in today's modern China, with the censorship of officials and commoners who have criticized the government. This criticism of the government is often seen as attempts at undermining the government's power, thereby promoting disunity, and thus they are stopped. Now, this belief that the state should be put over the individual can be traced all the way back to the Shang dynasty in approximately 2000 BCE. From there, you can see it transforming and changing until it has arrived at what it is today in modern China. I'll start off with the Shang sumptuary laws. The sumptuary laws were a set of laws that prohibited anyone but the noble and the king from owning bronze ritual vessels. Even then, the nobles could not own as much as the king. In fact, the noble could only own a set amount lower than the king. Now, this is a very primitive attempt at a very primitive form of the philosophy of primitive manifestation of the philosophy which I just described. The Shang king has chosen to establish a clear boundary between those who are rulers, the king and the nobles, and those who are the subjects, peasants, farmers, artisans, slaves, in lieu of keeping the individual's right to own anything he or she wants. Now, this is further cemented in the Zhou dynasty, especially with the arrival of Confucius, a very influential philosopher in Chinese history. Confucius believes that harmony, which is basically unity, is only subordinate to ritual. So basically, he says that the only time where you can violate harmony, the only time where you can take an action that will not bring harmony, is when you are obeying ritual. Now, ritual is Confucius' way of civilizing people so that they may achieve harmony, so it's not altogether too different. As such, Confucius believes that the sumptuary laws were integral to establishing harmony. And this is exemplified in an Analect 3.22, in which he says, only the ruler of a state can set a screen in his gate, but Guangzhong, a disobedient noble, has also set a screen in his gate. Only the ruler of a state, when meeting with another ruler, can use a special stand to rest his cup, but Guangzhong has also used such a stand. And one may ask, why is Confucius so angry at the fact that Guangzhong disobeyed the sumptuary laws? As I said before, he believes that they promote disunity, and in some ways it's pretty justified when looking at his time period. The emperor was but a puppet, and the nobles had free reign over their territory, hence why they disobeyed the sumptuary laws and didn't get any retaliation. With the establishment of sumptuary laws, however, the king soon gains authority over the nobles, and thus the nobles are not allowed to do whatever they want as they did during Confucius' time. Two other important philosophies also emerged during Confucius' time, Taoism and legalism. Legalism isn't too different from Confucianism. It also says that the state should be prioritized over the rights of the individual. This is pretty apparent when reading their doctrine, which calls for the establishment of an absolute ruler. This absolute ruler can undertake any action regardless of what it causes, as long as it benefits the people. Thus, the ruler may undergo the cruelest of actions as long as it brings benefit to his people. And a legalist advocate, Han Feizi, exemplified this in a quote in which he said, the reason you cannot rely on the wisdom of the people, as you would in a democracy, is that they have the minds of little children. If the child's head is not shaved, its sores will spread, and if its bow is not lanced, it will become sicker than ever. But when it is having its head shaved or its bow lanced, as a legalist ruler, which is basically when a legalist ruler is doing a cruel action to his people, someone must hold the child down while the loving mother performs the operation, and it yells and screams incessantly, for it does not understand that the little pain it suffers now will bring great benefit later. And this refers to the fact that the people will react very violently against the cruel actions of the ruler, despite the fact that the cruel actions, or seemingly cruel actions rather, are just for the benefit of the people. Next we'll move on to Taoism. Taoism, in my opinion, is the most unique out of the three doctrines because it, unlike the others, does not establish the priority of the state over the individual. In fact, it's pretty anti-state. Lao Tzu once said, "The perfect ruler is but a shadow to his people," and when an achievement happens, when it, when an achievement happens, the people say it is all natural. We did it. And it contrasts this with modern day, where economic achievements are often attributed to the ruler. And we'll zoom forward to the Qin dynasty, relatively much after the Zhou dynasty, where Qin Shi Huangdi takes power. And Qin Shi Huangdi is interesting because he's the first legalist ruler in the history of China. What this means is that we get to see this philosophy in action, this philosophy of state over the individual. And it's especially embodied in the building of the Great Wall. The Great Wall was built to protect the northern borders of China, and by extension the people there, from nomad incursions. However, the Great Wall was built at a great expense to the lives of the peasants who built them, and to the coffers of those who supplied the money to build the Great Wall in the form of enormous taxes. Now, Qin Shi Huangdi, in the typical legalist, as a typical legalist ruler, did this lanced the boils by building the wall, while the child screamed, while the people got angry at him for levying such large taxes. Unfortunately for Qin Shi Huangdi, the legalist philosophy did not work out for him, as his dynasty was overthrown by the Han. With the emergence of the Han, we see another interesting ruler similar to Qin Shi Huangdi, Liu Bang. Liu Bang is the first Taoist ruler of Chinese history, and more interestingly, he represents a crossroads in Chinese ideology. If he succeeds in establishing a government that lasts for a very long time, then his philosophy, the individual rights, can be seen as being more important than the state, survives. Legalism didn't survive because Qin Shi Huangdi's model didn't work. So if Liu Bang's model worked, then it would survive. And Liu Bang enforced this ideology in his establishment of only 3 laws. And these 3 laws were: one may not steal from another, one may not harm another, and one may not kill another. Now, as you can clearly see, people in this time, theoretically, had much more freedom than in any time in the past. They didn't have to build a Great Wall. They also didn't have to obey sumptuary laws. They were pretty much free. They just didn't have to do things which they probably wouldn't do in their normal life. Unfortunately for Liu Bang, this model didn't work too well. Many problems soon arose that were reminiscent of the Zhou dynasty, and were only solved much later by generations later by Wu Di. Wu Di was a Confucian ruler, and therefore he did indeed follow the philosophy that the state should be put over any individual rights. Or rather, he first levied enormous amounts of taxes on the people in order to fund wars against the northern nomads, which brought relative peace. In fact, there's a peace survival, the Pax Romanica, occurring in Rome at approximately the same time. He also quieted any officials who criticized him. And one may view this as a pretty horrific act, but you have to realize that Wu Di inherited a pretty weak dynasty. As I said before, it had numerous problems that he needed to solve. If the scholars disrupted his government in any way, caused him to be overthrown, caused his ministers to disagree with him, or anything like that, the reforms would be stalled, and the Han dynasty may have failed, maybe a few generations after him, maybe during his reign, which was pretty terrible because, as we've seen in the Warring States period, disunity is not good for the average person. We also see Wu Di nationalizing various industries that merchants own, again in a move that says we don't care about the individual's rights because the state can do much better for the people. Now, this belief that's been shown so far, this belief that the state should take precedence over individual rights, is not very unique to China. In fact, in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome, both of which are famous for having democracy, The exact same belief was pretty present within the population. Socrates, for example, a famous philosopher, did not took the hemlock poison and did not just run away from his execution because he believed that the law was that the democratic principles should not be disobeyed. The law was the law. He couldn't disobey it no matter what. Therefore, he prized the integrity of the law over his own life, something which is very reminiscent of the legalist thought that the law that the ruler enacts are more important for the people than their some petty rights. Now we fast forward all the way to the People's Republic of China during the 20th century, starting at Mao's reign, Mao's rule rather. Now Mao is again, like Liu Bang, a very interesting person because he represents a crossroads yet again. A crossroads of Western thought, communism, and Eastern thought, the philosophy to which I've been talking about this whole time. Now, how one might ask, how is it a crossroads if China is a communist country today and still holds Chinese values? Well, Marx called for a dictatorship of the proletariat after the revolution was successful, and the revolution Mao instigated was indeed successful. Therefore, dictatorship of the proletariat should have happened. However, it did not. Contrary to popular misconception, the dictatorship of the proletariat does not mean the workers literally have a dictatorship in the country. The one person rules the entire country. It means that the capitalists and the bourgeoisie are excluded from a democracy to which only the proletariat can participate in. Mao did not establish such a democracy. Instead, he took power into his own hands and established an authoritarian rule in which he and a group of party officials ruled the country through bureaucracy. Now, why did he do this? He did this similar to Wu Di. He inherited an extremely weak country which had little infrastructure because most of it was destroyed during the war, and he had no gold reserves because the ROC took it all. So he had to create a stable government which would not be stalled by democratic inefficiency, people's indecision, so that he may enact reform and accelerate China towards a developed country. Interestingly, Mao also directly violated the right to free speech during his reign in the Hundred Flowers campaign. The Hundred Flowers campaign allowed people to openly say whatever they wanted about the government. Unfortunately, their criticisms were not only high in number, but also very, 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 very severe. So the government was actually being undermined by the Hundred Flowers campaign. Mao decided that this underminement was not worth the petty rights it brought. So he stopped the Hundred Flowers campaign and instead instigated a campaign against those who criticized him, silencing them and pretty much sending a message to everybody that Mao would not tolerate criticism of his government. Next, we have Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping represents a change in the economic policy of China, but does not represent a change in the philosophy which I've been talking about. This can be seen in the Tiananmen Square protests, or the Tiananmen Square massacre as it's called in the West. In the Tiananmen Square protests, protesters, generally students and even workers, occupied the Tiananmen Square, which is a pretty important site in China, in Beijing, because that's where Deng was supposed to meet the Soviet premier. Deng immediately labeled these protesters as causers of turmoil. And this is interesting because Deng viewed these protesters not as threats to his own power, but threats to the unity of China. And as we've seen, disunity in China has been pretty disastrous for the Chinese people. The warlord era, the warring states period, and the period of disunity have all brought suffering to the people. Therefore, we see Deng not being some whimsical ruler who merely wants to keep his own wealth and gain more wealth, but as a legalist ruler who does what is good for his people at any cost. And that is the state over the individual rights philosophy applied to most of the history of China. I hope you've learned something by listening to what I've said. Thank you, and Have a nice winter vacation.